So we're here with Bobbi French, author of The Good Women of Safe Harbour. And first of all, Bobbi, congratulations on The Good Women of Safe Harbour winning the Newfoundland Reads competition. That's really exciting and it must feel really great.
Thank you. Yeah, it was super fun because libraries, man, right? I just like there's no love like library love, so it's great.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I will get to libraries in a little bit because there's
Yeah.
an amazing librarian character in this novel. But first I want to ask about writing about mental illness in general. So there's so many levels of and layers of mental illness represented in your novel. Um, I would say most pointedly in the protagonist Frances's mother's bouts of depression,
Mm.
um, and her eventual suicide, although I will also ask later about Frances's own issues. Can you tell us why it was important to you to write a novel that deals with these kinds of topics?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, the very practical piece of that is my former life as a psychiatrist. So this is all very familiar to me. But I've been out of the business for a while. And when I sat down to write this book, I found that in my head, I was only interested in writing about, well, first of all, women, because I'm very interested in women. But all the people who had come through my life, women and girls, were really in my head. And I wanted to, I guess, talk about in the book, write about an extraordinary thing being done by a very ordinary person. And my experience of ordinary people doing extraordinary things are people who are really burdened and who are overlooked, underestimated, burdened, and suffering, yet interesting, wise, intelligent, resilient, funny as hell, impressive individuals who are surviving things that I think are almost unimaginable at times, right? And so I couldn't imagine writing about anything else. So for me, it was so compelling to tell that kind of story. And, certainly it was important to me to have a purpose, I guess, writing a novel. It was my first novel. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I wanted to lean into empathy. And one of my issues with people with mental illness, of course, is, I'm not sure we have enough empathy for people who are suffering these, the entire spectrum from having poor mental or lack of mental wellness to major mental illness being that big spectrum, right? So it was more just, I couldn't even think of anything else to write about, so interesting to me.
And it's just a fascinating novel, and the characters are amazing. Frances Delaney is such a complex and well-rounded character. I just found her so compelling. You used the word compelling. She's compelling. She's
Oh,
she's undergone trauma in all these different ways, particularly in her childhood. So her
yeah.
fisherman father's death by drowning, her unexpected pregnancy and then a forced childbirth when she's 16, her mother's suicide that same year, her schism with her lifelong best friend Annie at 18. And then in the present tense of the novel, that's all in the past. In the present tense, there's her brain tumor and her wish to have a medically assisted death, which is
Mm.
really the crux of the novel. She's also a character who constantly talks about her nerves, and we would call that anxiety.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering what your inspirations were for creating such an amazingly complex and anxiety-ridden character.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, you know, I guess I was leaning into my teachings as well. So one of the things that I learned from working in teams, right? So I had the profound privilege of working with multidisciplinary teams and working with the most skilled, intuitive, amazingly talented social workers and psychologists and so on and so forth. And, our job was to wade through complexity, and people would come to us with their illness. And just so you know that my experience is with, it's not like doing light psychotherapy or anything. I was working in the trenches, frontline, mental health care, major mental illness. So people are so complex, right? I didn't know how complex she was, to be honest with you, until she was written. I was writing her as I went along. Everything in this book happened as I went along. I didn't plan it out. I sat down and I had this woman getting dressed to do something that was going to be difficult but meaningful. And that's where it started. And so obviously all these people, all these complexities of the patients I've seen, of the people I work with, of the women in my life personally, are all in there somewhere, and they're just coming out. And so people say, well, what's your process? And I say, I don't have no process, because this is my first book. Right? So she developed as I went along, and I needed her to be seeking resolution. What I didn't realize is how much resolution. I didn't have it in my head about how many cumulative, in the business, in the psych business, we call it cumulative losses, how many cumulative catastrophic losses that she had. But I needed her to be coming out of something, to be able to lean into her impending death as an opportunity. And I wanted people to meet her in that opportunity. I wanted her to have dominion over it, something in her life for a change. I wanted her to just have something, because, yeah, sorry, I'm all over the place here, but recently I went to a book club and there was a woman who told me she felt this character was unrealistic because nobody could ever suffer that much loss. And I said, wow. In my world, this loss, Frances's level is about medium hard, from what I've experienced in terms of what people are carrying. So, her complexity and her anxiety. I also thought she was very relatable if she had an anxiety disorder. I think anxiety is one of the things that most people can really relate to. Not everybody can relate to severe depression. Not everybody can relate to suicidality, but everybody at some point has had some anxiety. And so I wanted to make sure that this character was, above all, engaging and relatable, so that I could then get people to be attached to her, and then she could reflect people's struggles and strengths in a way that I felt was respectful to the people who I've been privileged to care for in my career,
Yeah, and that level of anxiety that she has, which sometimes is quite acute and sometimes isn't. The thing I found so interesting about it was the ways in which she quells her anxiety. So the first is cleaning and tidying. So she turns that into her livelihood in St. John's as a housekeeper and a cleaning woman. But there's also this really poignant moment in the novel when Frances says that knowing that she's dying takes away her anxiety. And so for me, I'm wondering, is Frances's propensity to clean and tidy a coping mechanism, or is it its own illness, or are we walking a fine line somewhere in the middle there? I'm just wondering where you see that cleaning compulsion coming in.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think again, that speaks to complexity of this character that I'm learning about all the time, because this is the first time I've thought about that. Oh, right. Is her cleaning? I know her cleaning is medicine, because she needs to quiet this head. She can, this is something she can control. This is so messy. Look at all this mess. And I can just take this bleach cloth and there it goes away, But yeah, and then it becomes something that she has to rely on. And it's, I guess, in her life, and we don't see all those years, but she just couldn't leave it then. I think we think about her as a living person. And as you know, we all fall into what's easy, be it helpful or not. Sometimes our patterns of behavior are just, this is what's easy. The other thing about cleaning for her is, and I think it's somewhere in the book, that she talks about moving through the world like a phantom, being invisible. And so being a cleaning person is a really good conduit for that kind of pathology, if you will, or that kind of, and there are two things here. She has a generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder. She also has a temperament. She's a shy temperament person and a quiet person. I also think that cleaning just allows her to be all in the background. And if I don't get involved with anybody in anything, nothing bad is ever going to happen to me. And I'm just going to make this all neat and tidy. So is it a compulsion? That's a good question. It certainly could be. It certainly could be. It's very astute, right?
Oh yeah. And given her mother's quite acute mental illnesses, it would make sense that there might be a genetic predisposition there too.
Well, that's the thing. So when we, in psychiatry, when people come to us, we look at, what are the precipitating factors? What are the protective factors? What are the perpetuating factors? And then there's the biological, the psychological, the sociocultural, the geopolitical, right? The trauma-based stuff. There's all of this together to figure out of what factors, and she has a ton of them. Her mother is seriously ill. I mean, I wrote that to be almost like a postpartum psychosis. And so for her mother to be able to tolerate the loss of her partner, who's obviously so loving and supportive, and then to be rearing a child alone and retreating in grief, and so sad. And that comes from my experience as well of working with children and youth who are living with parents who have major mental illness, which is incredibly difficult experience. And what I needed from that as a writer was to establish a setup where this woman, Annie Malone, just to set up how meaningful she is to Frances. She is her love. She is her family. She is her solace. She is her parent. She is her, she's everything. And then she's gone. And so it had to be big.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking again about her idea of death as kind of anti-anxiety.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if it's a comment on the idea of uncertainty as one of the main sources of general anxiety among people. Because I think if you know the certainty of death, then suddenly maybe you are able to let go of that anxiety a little bit. And maybe it's uncertainty that drives us towards that anxiety.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, there are a couple of things in life that we always have to accept. And one is pain. There is no life without pain. And there is no life without uncertainty. Right? And the other thing is that the struggle that we always have to work to keep these things at bay. And, this causes a lot, but you're absolutely right. I think what happens is with the death is that there's a line where she goes to the psychiatrist, I think, to get the okay to refuse treatment. And the psychiatrist asks her if she's suicidal or has been suicidal. And she wonders if being tired of living is the same thing. And I think she's so tired with her burdens that I find there's some relief for her in impending death. It's like, you know what? I'm done with this. I'm tired. She's not willing to take her own life throughout her whole life by some miracle. But she's tired. And then there's the other component of the focusing of things. So when death is impending, what else is there to worry about anymore? There's only now, there's only this, there's only the focus, right? So there's that psychological thing. And then there's a more pathological thing of being quasi-suicidal, I guess, or fatigued,
Yeah, and we get that parallel when she herself recognizes that what her mother went through before she suicided was that she just couldn't bear the pain of living anymore. And it takes her so long to come to that realization. But she then is able to make that parallel distinction between herself and her mom, where they're almost doing the same thing in her mind, I think.
I think that was really important to me because I wanted to, I didn't have a whole lot that I wanted to say with this novel, but there were a couple of things. And one of the ones was the concept of laying it down. And that's why the squid says lay it down. I want people to understand. I have a very intimate knowledge with suicide, as you can imagine, throughout my work. is that people die of mental illness. So Frances's mom died of depression. What did she die of? The same way my mom died of actually a brain tumor. My friend's mom dies of breast cancer. You know, these are disorders that people die from. It's just that the mechanism of the death is the suicide. And this is what people are reacting to. And you can have all the treatment in the world, and you can have the best team, and that's people still die of mental illness. And you know, a lot of people were really shocked by this. They said, well, why would you have her die? Why would you have her mother, you know, commit, which we don't say anymore, commit suicide while her daughter's away? That would never happen. She would never do that. I said, no. We don't. The when doesn't matter. The context of it doesn't matter. What matters is this woman's illness was so terrible and severe that she died from it. So she's not sitting around going, you know, twisting her mustache, you know, when am I going to create the most chaos with my illness? And so I was hoping that people would take away, wow, mental illness is hardcore, man, you know, and it is.
Yeah, and I can say as someone who lives with quite severe mental illness,
Mm.
and who has attempted suicide several times, that was the part of the novel that really spoke to me, because I could see the patterns in Frances's mother's life, that so the situational things that led to her depressions, which were clearly like severe clinical depression.
Mm.
Um, so the postpartum, the post-death, all those things. But I really felt that you portrayed her illness as an illness in itself, and not as something to be pitied, or something to be, you know, like made spectacular, which sometimes those things are. I felt the way you did it was with such compassion, and it really made me appreciate that component of the novel, because it's not like the primary component of the novel, but as someone who's lived that kind of experience, I really felt that your compassion was very strong, and I just wanted to tell you that.
Oh, Triny, you know, first of all, thank you so much for trusting me with that information. That's really, really, really good of you, and I really appreciate it. And this is so meaningful to hear from you, because I want people who know me as a psychiatrist, or people who know me as a friend, or people who know me as a mental health advocate, to feel that from this book. And it's if only you in the world feel that from this book, then I feel it was worth every second of my time, because that is exactly what I am trying to say. And it feels like sometimes my whole career in mental health, and I've always wanted to do something artsy, and they've just come together in this way. It's really interesting to me. And I think that if we can just create some understanding and empathy and humor and all, you know, the light, the dark life itself around these major mental illnesses, then we're doing something good with our words and our art and our poetry and our what have you. And then all of a sudden, writing a little novel becomes an important endeavor. Writing a book of poetry about one's journey through mental health care system, right, becomes an important endeavor, a healing endeavor. I've had so many emails from people about this book that knock me out about how meaningful it is for them, either because of around the assisted dying, or loneliness, or anxiety, suicide, forgiveness, friendship, what have you. And so people are really connecting with this character and her dilemma in incredible ways. And I think what you just said is an incredible connection in this book. Right. And so I feel like my work on the planet is done. Like it feels like, you know, I don't know if I can write another book now, you know.
I think you can.
I hope so. But you know, but you know, you know, we need to talk about too that there's a tremendous amount of difficulty in this book. There's a tremendous amount of light, and there's a tremendous amount of joy and passion and discovery. like Frances discovering her love for Annie being much more dimensional than she imagined it to be is interesting to me as well.
Mm.
Her relationship with this young girl, Edie, that I don't think would have happened had she not been dying. That's really something to see. And I'm not sure, I don't think without the intervention of this young kid who says, you know, within 5 minutes of a lifetime of searching, oh, is this your friend on the phone? You know, I'm not sure that she would have gone home and reconnected with Annie in this way. So, you know, there's joy here as well, I think, you know, and I think that we have to think about mental illness in that way too. And that, of course, it's difficult, and you know better than most, but there's joy, and there's lightness, and there's hope, and there's love, and there's all those things as well in the journey, right?
Absolutely. And I think what we see through Frances is a form of healing because there is a resolution. It's a form of healing that I think does give hope, even though she dies. You know,
Yeah.
like it is okay to die. We are all going to die anyway. Um, but the fact that she is able to heal that mother wound and heal that Annie wound, which are kind of one and the same rolled in together.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also to have that autonomy over her body that she wasn't able to have when she was pregnant at 16 and forced to give birth at a convent and all of that, you know, like this autonomy she has, this major decision she's able to make is so important, and it comes out in so many different and interesting ways in the novel. One of the things that really struck me was Frances thinking of her tumor as a squid. um so it's kind of like kind of settled in her brain, but also sort of taking over her brain, and it does talk to her sometimes. And it made me think about how Frances thinks of the sea as something she can't bear. And so by extension, like by metonymy, the squid is the thing she can't bear, right? The part of the sea that she can't bear. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk about the squid as a metaphor for
Yeah.
Frances's pain.
Yeah, I think so. People really like the character of the squid. So you know, it's very practical in some ways as a metaphor because it does offer some lightness at points. And you know, I got to give a reader a couple of little things to, you know, to be. But it also comes from experience of people in my life as in medicine again, of people, particularly kids, sometimes will name you know, Mr. Cancer, or you know, the demon, or they'll call it something, and it gives that sense of control and autonomy and so on. What I really found the squid metaphor, or so when I really found it metaphorical, was at the very end, and she's almost at the end, and the squid is, you know, saying something, and she says, oh, you know, stop nattering at me, you know, show some decency, and the thing she says to the squid is, don't you see I have the upper hand? And I wanted her to be able to say that to somebody at some point. I just didn't know how it was going to happen. And again, it just happened, and it evolved. And as I was writing, then the squid became this character. But I think it is a metaphor for the. And then someone said to me, "Oh, and yes, you've chosen a you know, particularly interesting sea animal in the North Atlantic." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I hadn't even thought of that." And then it's only in hindsight that I think about that being reminiscent of everything: the island, the sea, the father, lost at sea, the reconciliation with the sea at the end, all of those things. And for me, it came about thinking about what I would feel like if I was lying in bed with a brain tumor in my head, and it growing and growing and growing and tentacling over in my head. And so from that, it just sort of rolled along. But I really like the squid. I'm really, really happy with it. In the end, I was very happy with her dominion over it. And even in her last breath, the squid is mentioned about kneeling, I think, in silent surrender in her mind, you know. And so it becomes this metaphor of, I have dominion over what happens to me. This is my choice. I got pregnant non-consensually. I was banished. I had my baby taken from me. But goddamn, I'm going to have the death I want, this life, this is not a life I wanted. This is a life that's just happened to me. So I feel it's a very trauma informed kind of death in this way. And I think if I had her as a patient and she came to me, I would be like, what can I do to facilitate this for you? Because I think this is incredibly therapeutic. I know you're dying. That doesn't alter the therapeutic nature of it from my perspective,
Absolutely. And speaking of therapy,
Yeah.
so as a former psychiatrist, I'm really interested in the idea that for me, I noticed that there's almost a glaring lack of medical characters in the novel. So there's the occasional scene with Francis's GP, there's the early scene with the psychiatrist. Um, but I'm just wondering if you can talk about why you wanted the narrative to focus almost exclusively on the non-clinical world around death and dying. So the friends and chosen family, they're the
Yeah.
ones at the core.
I think I just wanted so much for her. I wanted to never look away from this woman. And metaphorically for me, it's that invisible woman, the woman who's never seen. And I wanted all eyes on her at all times. I did want to wade into it as well, because I just thought if she could manage to do this without interference, and I use that in a polite way because let's face it, the depiction of psychiatry in literature is not lovely. 2 words, Hannibal Lecter. But anyway, who was a psychiatrist. And I think I just wanted to stay away from all of the technical aspects of it because I think it's so fraught. For some reason, there is, for lack of a better term, I think there's a schism sometimes between, I don't know how to say this properly. I think medical care and psychiatry gets a bad rap sometimes. Not sometimes, a lot of times. I just finished reading reading an early copy of a book called Once Upon an Effing Time by a woman named Bobbi French. And this is a big mental health book. Everyone's going to want to write this down because this is unlike anything I've ever read. She nails it. She gets everything right. Like really a lot. And there's a benevolent therapist in there. And I was so almost in tears because it was so relieving to me, because I've known so many wonderful therapists. And so I think it's fraught sometimes to write about it because people have had such difficult experiences. People have had such positive experiences. And I was fearful that it might distract from her and her journey. And I was also wanting to just focus on her internal process of rising to it on her own. But at the same time, it's also a reflection of this woman has lived her entire life without any care.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important, not even as a metaphor. I think it's important to just be showing that people, huge swaths of people who are very ill and who could benefit so greatly from therapy, never have any sort of intervention because they have no access. And this is a public health crisis in my mind. This is, I don't know how to describe it or to begin to talk about the travesty that this is in our world, to have mental health neglected in so many stunning ways. And I don't have to tell you this, Triny, right? If you've been through a system, you know what it's like. So it stands for that as well. But again, I have to tell you, this is all after the fact. I did not think about this at the time when I was writing. This is post writing reflection of it, because it makes me sound like some artiste and some person who knew what the F they were doing, because I did not. So what I'm learning about is from people like you who come to me with this beautiful analysis that I'm so grateful for, and tell me about my own book, and I learn about it. And it makes me happy and it makes me love it, So I'm very appreciative.
That's wonderful. Um, I'm thinking about these really key women in Frances's life. So particularly Annie and Edie, who
Mm.
are one is her oldest friend and is her own age. One is her youngest friend and one of her only friends, and is also a newish friend, like
Yeah.
5 or 6 years in her life. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about the difference between friendship and kinship in the novel, because for me, I see these characters as kin rather than just friends. And I think kinship ends up for me being a really telling and important feature of those relationships because in the queer world we talk about chosen family, and I feel like this is what Frances has developed, is she's really reached out and dug down deep to be able to even have one or two members of a chosen family for herself.
This is hugely for me about chosen family, and I'm really glad you're tapping into that because um, I still believe this is a queer story from my perspective. People debate it and this and that, and I said, well, her sexuality is not up in question. That's what we're talking about because it's really in theory rather than practice. This poor woman has been so isolated. But back to chosen family, yeah, kinship is the thing, and the connection of Annie and Frances. There's a word that she uses early in the book and calls it inextricable.
Mhm.
And there's an inextricability of these two people. And then when they come in later, their kinship continues because Annie has suffered the unimaginable loss of a child in a terrible accident, and then the failure of a terrible marriage. And that's such a huge loss. And she did that alone without her friend and longed for her friend. And she lost her friend. Her friend just disappeared. And I can only imagine that Annie would have really internalized that, like, oh, I chose this husband and he was a, shitty husband, right? What was it all for?
Yeah.
Right. So there's that whole kinship. And then there's the kinship between Edie and Frances, which is quite deliberate on my part. I wanted the two of them to have the same experience of an unwanted pregnancy. And I wanted to just show the difference that a generation makes. Now, I'm fearful that we're going backwards in the world with these things. If we look at what's happening in the U.S. and in Poland or Uganda or anywhere else, even in our own country, but I really wanted that juxtaposition, and I thought that is the point of kinship for them. This is the ultimate predicament of women, to not have autonomy over whatever it is, be it sexuality, be it reproductive choice, be it how they live, who they live with, being the stewards of their own destinies, for to sound a bit romantic about it, but it's kind of true. So I love this word kinship, and I think that if that's what you're getting from the book, then once again, that is a huge happiness point for me, I guess, because it makes me feel all happy because I think the kinship between women, and I think particularly in the queer community, or particularly in the disability community, which is my community at the moment, but that kinship is life-saving, life-preserving. Where would the queer community be without chosen family? I shudder to imagine.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into something else I wanted to ask you about, um, which is that we have this character of Hillary, the librarian, and she's good friends with Edie's mother, Liz Cleary, and we can't quite figure out how
Yep.
and why they're twins, right?
Why?
Um, but Frances has an obvious attachment to Hillary, and it's hard to say whether she wants to be her or she wants to be with her. That's kind of a classic queer meme, right? Like, do I want to be you or do I just want to be with you? So I just wonder if you can talk about Hillary as a really key character or figure in
Yeah.
Frances's.
Well, Hillary's the stand-in of my love for librarians, of course, and on all things library. So in my mind, I had no idea how much mystique there was going to be around this character. because I've done, I think, 38 virtual book clubs now. And the very first question out of everybody's mouth is, Hillary, is she the daughter? What's going on? Is she attracted to her? What's going on? And so for me, it was very black and white as I was writing her. This is Frances's daughter, who she has somehow discovered outside of our gaze as readers. We know she's had information. We know she's had connections with people like the social systems who could help her find her daughter. And she has been observing her from afar for many years in this library, which is why she goes to this library. At the same time, though, I think it's entirely, so everybody asks me, is she the daughter? Tell us the answer. There was 2 women at a book club that I went, had $50 writing on this. And I said, yeah, in my mind, she's her daughter. It's black and white. And she was like, hey, pay up. I said, no, hold on. Because as I say to people, I don't write the book for my own entertainment. I'm writing it to be consumed, right? I want people to read it. So however you see the relationship between Hillary, whatever it is for you at the end of the book, I don't care. Whatever speaks to you. So some women say, well, I like it to think that when she was dying, this is what she would want her daughter to be. That's fantastic. That's a beautiful ending. Loves it. Great. Other people will say, well, I thought there was some sort of attraction. And I think that's the kind of woman she would have wanted to spend her life with, in love with. Had this been, possible for her, she could have been a lover of her. I say, great. That's fantastic. So whatever way people see it. And this has been one of the happiest things for me about the book, is finding out that this is so interpretable, if that's a word. And it's so funny because the queer women who have come and read this book, they sort of like, well, I thought she was attracted to her. And I said, well, yeah, maybe you're going to be more biased to see it that way. I don't know. I don't know. And it just makes me happy all over, how anybody sees it. Love it. Just love it.
I love it too. I love that there are so many possible interpretations. As a queer person, I definitely saw it as more of a queer desire, queer longing.
Love it. Love it.
But I also, of course, had that in the back of my mind, is this her daughter? And if so, is it her idealized daughter or her actual daughter,
Yeah, and it could be both. And she could be an idealized partner. She could be, and she's certainly an idealized friend. Mm-hmm. And if we just blur all the lines between how women, back to your kinship point, but how we exist in our circles of community of women and kinship and stuff, friends, lovers, daughters, mothers, all this stuff. I really like all those different connections, and it makes me feel really, really warm about the characters. And I am just so interested in the kinship community of women, and what passes between us, all different kinds of love, all different kinds of anger, all different kinds of betrayal and angst, everything that makes up the experience of being women,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's done so well. You just did it so well.
Oh, thank you.
For me, one of the most compelling parts of the novel, and that's probably because I'm a poetry professor, is something a reader could easily overlook, I think, which is the poem that's tacked on Edie's bedroom wall that Frances finally reads, which is Mary Oliver's Wild Geese. And I kind of want to read that poem now and ask you about it, because it's one of those poems that actually occupies a little space in my brain at all times, because whenever I read it, this was years and years ago, there's certain lines that just stick with you. And this whole poem sticks with me. So I almost feel like this is a thesis statement for the good women of Safe Harbor, is this poem. So I'm just going to read it.
What is this interview? This is like the interview of my dreams. What is happening? Go ahead.
So this is Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about the importance of this poem to the idea of what is good and how that plays into the novel.
I think everything plays into it. I mean, Mary Oliver's poetry sometimes, I'm not an expert in poetry, of course, and I bow down to you because I love it so much, but I never know what it is. I'm lost. I'm in the weeds all the time. This whole this wild and precious life, and it's become so what's the word? Like things that get put on cups and doilies and I think that's really too bad because I think these poems from her are so amazing and beautiful. And I actually wanted to excerpt it and have more in it. And I was not permitted. I contacted the Mary Oliver. You probably know this, but you cannot touch this stuff. They won't let you even have a line. You have to, do whatever. And I wanted to, I struggled with it because the poem was so meaningful, all the work, all her stuff so meaningful to me. And to use anything in the book, I was so afraid, especially when I used the wild and precious life. I thought that's going to get slayed because people are going to say, that's so Oprah. That's not poetry. And I say, screw that. That is beautiful poetry. There's nothing quite like this. And this whole concept of despair and show me your story, all this stuff, right? I mean, so for me, it was really important. And I wanted her to carry that with her. And I wanted her to be caught. Like there was that moment where she said it actually caused her to just go, and then she's sitting in the bath thinking, oh, if that poet knew me, they would say I'd squandered my life. And then she immediately rejects it. So I think it's really important, this poem. And I think it's, I hope people take it for the depth and interest in it that I had in it, because it was really meaningful for me. And you mentioned going back to dying early, how we're all dying. Yeah, this is the one dance we're all getting invited to. And the other thing I wanted from this book is for people to think about that. Right? What are you doing with your life? What is your thing? Now, recognizing that people who are suffering from severe mental illness, that's not front of mind. Front of mind is getting well, but it's also motivating to get well, or to seek treatment, or to realize that there is hope even when you have a major mental illness. So many people, and Triny, this, people who have major mental illnesses are thriving and doing well and living fantastic lives. And so I wanted it to be hopeful. And I always ultimately find Mary Oliver's work so hopeful. Now, you can tell me as the professor whether I'm off, but it feels so heartfelt, but hopeful as well, Is that fair to say about her work?
Absolutely. It's because there's that distinction between heartfelt and sentimental, and generally people poo-poo sentimental poetry. But I wouldn't consider Mary Oliver's poetry sentimental. I would consider it very heartfelt and emotionally driven.
What's
But
so bad about that?
yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. And to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. I mean, that is
That's
just,
gold, baby.
it is gold. It's poetry in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And that first line, you do not have to be good, period. That is such a startling way to start a poem. And then to have it in, referenced indirectly, because I think you don't even use the title of the poem in the novel.
No, I
But
don't. So, yeah.
yeah, but a book called The Good Women of Safe Harbor. And, to reference this poem that starts, "You do not have to be good," it just makes me so interested in what goodness even means, where someone like Edie as a character is described as just holding all the goodness in the world by Frances. And then I think like, well, what does good mean?
This is a good question. In my culture, the phrase "a good woman" is hefty. It is thick. It is large. It encompasses a woman's intentions. It encompasses her compassion, her skill, her competencies, her tenacity. So it's never said lightly. Oh, yeah, she's a good woman. It's big. And I had a lot of trouble coming up with a title with this book. And we finally came to, I wanted to call it just Good Women, but I wanted to make sure. And then when we added, my editor wanted the Good Women of Safe Harbor, and I hated it. And then now I'm so grateful for it. You know why? Because my Good Women includes Frances's mother.
Mm.
My Good Women includes someone who died by suicide, someone who is ill. My Good Woman includes Edie, who is the promise of all things good in the next generation that I hope great things for. But primarily, I wanted that judgment term about these complex, flawed, multidimensional, ill, challenged, brilliant, surviving, dying women to be good. It's all good, baby. Like, it's just good. And the other thing is that challenging is, as you're saying, the notion of what is good, like be a good girl. I mean, that's a loaded term for us gals. I mean, my mom, not long before she died, be a good girl. And I said, could you stop saying that to me? What does that even mean? So I like it now. I like that it includes everybody, and I like it's a nod to my culture as well. So
Yeah, I like that too. Thank you for sharing that, and also for addressing the nuances of what good can
yeah,
mean.
yeah.
um, One of the themes that comes up for me in the novel is rebirth.
Mm,
So there's like ideas of rebirth after someone's death, rebirth after childbirth, rebirth after reconnection. I feel like there's all these ways in which not just Frances, but all the women go through forms of rebirth. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about what rebirth means to you in the context of this novel.
I think for me, and the rebirth in this novel is intrinsically tied to reconnection and reconciliation.
Mm.
So that when but the moment of rebirth for me in this is when she goes back and she's in the water again for the first time. And that, I think there's no, gosh, I'm just learning that now. There's no coincidence to have that connected with water. And it's interesting because a line that I deleted from the initial draft of the book was, "We all begin in water, the warm slosh of the womb." And I had to lose it, and it was killing me. I really liked it, right? And yet I brought her back into this water, into this cold water. And she's feeling like, oh, I've never felt so blissfully alive. I've never felt so alive as I do in this moment. So really what she's doing is reconnecting with her past, reconnecting with her, and, reconciling her fear. That water is big trouble for her. So there's certainly that for Frances. But I also think Annie is reborn as well.
Mm.
She is dead inside. I think she's had a dead marriage. She's had a dead child. She has a shitty daughter. Her daughter is not great. She has a pretty poor relationship with her. And so she says, "Frances, you coming home again?" She says, "I feel like my life is beginning again." And then she says, "Oh my God, that's terrible to say because my friend is dying." But really, that's the gift, and so the gift that they give each other is probably a new life. And even though Frances's new life is only for a month, it's still being reborn.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of poetic, isn't it? Getting reborn for just like a day, right?
It is, but it's beautifully poetic, and it makes so much sense that Annie is also, and even Edie after her abortion, like they are
Yeah.
reborn, right?
Yeah. And I think that Edie is now forever, again, inextricable now with Frances. And she will think of Frances and she will remember her, and she will, maybe she'll be mad that she wasn't told about the assisted death, but later she'll understand. And she'll think of that, and she'll know her own capacity for care and love and compassion and empathy. And I think in my head, I imagine Annie going to tell Edie that Frances has died and telling her the whole story about Frances's mother and what happened, and just telling her the whole story. And then Edie sort of taking that and going, wow, that was my cleaning lady, And so there's a rebirth potential there, that kind of thing. I tend to think about these people as real people. Like, I often wonder what they're doing. Like, it's just some sort of psychosis, right? These are people you made up in your head, right? Good Lord.
So I want to talk a little bit about Newfoundland. It's a really crucial backdrop to everything that takes place in the novel. From the small bay community of Safe Harbor to Frances's kind of lonely version of St. John's. I just wonder if you can talk about what it's like to write about Newfoundland and its culture, particularly with the ongoing remnants of conservative Catholicism that's happening as a sort of subtext to lots of things going on in the novel, and other forms of conservatism that we get.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a couple of things. Obviously, I haven't been home in a while. I have disabilities that limit travel, so I haven't been home for years and years and years and years and years. And so there's definitely nostalgia for me. But my nostalgia is always complicated because of the Catholic Church. And this is a tough area, because I never mean to bang against anybody's faith. I'm only talking about the atrocities and the sectarian hate and let's call it what it is. It was sectarian hatred toward women, toward people of Indigenous background, we all know this terrible story, but particularly to women. And I was really wanting to tap into the shame and the guilt. And there is no better culture to tap into that. Perhaps the Irish culture, which is the same as Newfoundland culture. It's the same. And so for me, it's also, it's the rough glory of Newfoundland too. Like, physically, the setting is so perfect for this book, because this is a rough story, but there's so much glory in it, like this. So it's such a perfect backdrop for this story, I think. But there's no doubt I didn't have much that I wanted to say in terms of book beyond choice, but I will tell you, I'll be very honest, I really wanted to have a go at the church. I wanted to have a go at the church for a very long time. I remember as a young girl, one time, we were about 15, 16, and I had a friend who was just, I don't know, the more the situation required her to be quiet, the louder she was. And we were in church at school, a school church, and she was nattering. I was like, shh, 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 shh. And this Irish priest stops the mass, and he says, "You two girls there, yes, you need to leave God's house. You will not stay in God's house. Out, out, I am casting you out." Literally, this is what he said. His name was Father Curley. I don't care if he's still alive and hears me. He was terrible. And so little tiny things like these, which is not a microaggression, but it's pretty bad. And being cast out of God's house, and all these things are in my head. And then, of course, there was all the time I spent, what I call in psychiatry, being in the room with the patient, with people who suffered at Mount Cashel, with women who suffered in Belvedere, which nobody ever likes to talk about, the nuns. So all this is in me, and it needs to come out somewhere. And I think it's important that it does, because these events created so much trauma. Frances' mother being buried outside the cemetery. So the stigma against those suffering, the stigma against women who became pregnant and no consequence for any boys, the stigma and the perpetuation of violence against women, male priests telling these women they had to stay with these violent men for the sake of God, and all the rest, on and on and on. So I think it was really important to me this particular type of sectarian thing. And, you know, unfortunately, it's not a nostalgic thing now, because look at where we are. I find it stunning. You know, we need only look to all varieties of sectarian hate. Like, we look at honor killings within faiths. We look at profound oppression of entire swaths of women among faiths, on and on and on. This silly nonsense of reproductive choices being anti-God or anti-religion or what have you, you know, all these things that are so damaging. And if we want to talk about mental illness, and I mean, these things as precipitating factors, I mean, it's staggering. So I think Frances's dilemma is very reflective of those struggles, but only in a medium way, because as bad as Frances's stuff is, it's nothing compared to atrocities that have occurred at the hands of a loving God and those who are the disciples and representatives of this loving God. And, you know, so we might be getting too political.
There's never too political.
But that's how I feel. And, you know, I watched something the other night. I can't remember what show it was. And someone asked someone, have you ever been part, the cop was saying, well, have you ever been part of a criminal organization? And the skeety guy says, well, I was raised Catholic. Right? And it sits with me, because to me, it feels like this, you know, unchecked criminal organization. And so then if we add in what I've seen among children and youth, around the sexual abuse and so on, and so it's very hard for me to be neutral. It's very hard for me to be dispassionate about that sort of thing. But interestingly, in a book club not long ago, there was a woman who was still remained Catholic despite all of this. And she was appreciative that I had put someone in the book, Sister Barb, who was at least kind and well-intentioned. And I said, you know what, let me tell you something. For all my railing, I have met people in my life. And there is an actual woman in my life named Sister Barb, who was very cool. And I think in a different time, if she could have reconciled her sexuality and her faith, she would have lived a much different life. And I felt for her in that. I felt that she could not be, you know, a lesbian and faithful at the same time back in the day. And so she was being oppressed by her own faith. And yet, you know, it was very complicated. Mm-hmm. It's complicated. But I did want to put her in there because I thought, well, here's another type of woman who's complex. And we have kinship with these kind of women as well.
Well, and what I loved about Sister Barb is that when Frances goes to see her years and years later, decades later, Sister Barb has left the Catholic Church, but she hasn't left God. And that's, I think, a really important distinction there.
Yeah, and I did that on purpose because I wanted to believe that this woman loved Frances, and that I wanted to believe that she thought she was helping Frances, and that someone in this life loved Frances Delaney, you know, and showed her some kindness, however twisted and bizarre it was. But I wanted also the resolution. I wanted Frances to say, you owe me this. And what better to bring to an old Catholic nun than my assisted death certificate, right? I thought it was kind of badass of Frances to do that, right?
Oh, it is. It is for sure. And I love the whole drawn out ceremonial aspect of her going to get her fancy fountain pen to sign the certificate as witness. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move into my last question, which is, your novel came out during a global pandemic.
Yep.
During this global pandemic, I think people's ideas and awarenesses about mental health issues and mental illness have broadened and deepened. And I'm just wondering if you want to talk a little bit about what that means for your novel coming out into the world.
Well, listen, I tell you, anything that broadens and deepens and people's thoughts about mental health and mental illness, I am all for, no matter how it comes. I didn't know there was going to be a global pandemic when I put this book out. What I think about is I wrote this book in the context of my very dramatic decline in my own health and becoming disabled. And I can tell you that when the lockdown happened, my life didn't change at all because I'm housebound, very much so. And I was thinking about isolation.
Mhm.
And it's no coincidence to me that I'm writing about a character who's very isolated, because I'm an isolated person. I've come to understand it and accept it and not rail against it as much as I used to. But I don't know how this would affect in terms of the book for me. I can tell you on practical things, it was very difficult because I didn't have a book launch. I didn't have any public events. I still can't do public events because of masking and stuff, because of my chronic problems, which makes me very high COVID risk. So I've never seen my book in a bookstore,
Wow.
that kind of thing. But what I can tell you is I can certainly relate to how the pandemic made people feel. And I used to feel like, you guys are amateurs, man. I've been at this for years. Suck it up, get together, But that's easy to say because people are so connected with their lives. But I felt to me like the pandemic was a mental health crisis at points.
Mm.
I don't know. I wish I knew more about it. The only thing I can say about the book in terms of, it was just so bittersweet. In terms of not being able to engage with people one-on-one. And so that's why I started doing so many book club visits and things like that. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think any global catastrophe is going to have impact on mental health, mental illness. I worry for us as a species because I don't think we've behaved very well in this pandemic. I don't think we did I think I would give us a big fat F on the report card myself. I don't see the compassion for one another. I think that if it's too hard to keep me and my husband alive, my husband is immune compromised as well, by putting a piece of fabric on your face at the grocery store, then where are we? Little children with cancer, people having chemotherapy, or just an old lady who you don't want to get COVID. So, there's all these things, but I'm not sure how it affects me in terms of tell me again what you really want to know from this thinking that I'm going through. What do you?
I guess I'm wondering if you think that there's a connection between putting a book out about mental health issues during the pandemic and accessing people's own anxieties and that kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting because then it becomes a bit of convenience because I didn't know, right? I mean, I signed the contract for the book in 2020, and then I knew it was, so this is pre-pandemic, early 2020, and then it's coming out in 2022. So there's all this happening. I remember thinking this. I do remember thinking, I wonder if people won't find this book palatable because of the isolation themes. And I wonder if they'll be prepared to read about these themes and someone dying. And I did wonder whether it would impact how many people it would reach. I knew this book was never going to be this big runaway bestseller because this is not what people don't, you have to write about. Someone would have to be stabbing her in a house, and it would have to be a thriller and a mystery for it to be this big. Don't get me started. But anyway, but I did wonder whether people would reject it out of hand. And so I was very anxious about that. that it wouldn't find an audience, that it wouldn't reach people who I wanted it to reach. And I was very relieved to see the opposite had happened. In fact, some people said, oh, it was just the thing for me to be reading. But I want to get this in because you never know how things are going to impact people. I have a friend who's in her early 40s, diagnosed with a very strange lung cancer. And she now lives with incredible uncertainty. She lives in 3-month periods because they're not sure how it's going to go for her. And so she was so excited for my book. I said, listen, you don't have to read my book. You have to buy it, but you don't have to read it. And she read it when she was ready. And she texts me, sends me this big text, with all the screaming. And she's, Bobbi French, you beautiful genius. You have helped me embrace my mortality.
Aww.
And I thought, okay, well, that's something, right? So if people could look at this and think about isolation in this way, if it helps them in that kind of thing, that's the only thing of connection with the pandemic I can think, because I didn't anticipate it. I mean, I'm not sure anybody wants to put a book out in a pandemic unless it's about a pandemic. But you know what? That was interesting too. There was like Sea of Tranquility and Emma Donohue's book. Oh my gosh, about the Spanish flu epidemic. The name escapes me. The Stars, something of the Stars. And I thought, well, who is going to read these books? Nobody's going to want to read about the pandemic. And they do.
Because they also want all this post-apocalyptic media, right? Like all these TV series and movies about that. That's what people are eating up right now.
Yeah, and I feel like for me, my own mental health is not served by that.
I agree. I agree.
My mental health is served by Fleabag and Ted Lasso and, Somebody Somewhere, this beautiful show called Somebody Somewhere, which is about this platonic woman finding her chosen family in the Midwest, platonic relationship between a straight woman and a gay man, and they're all chosen family. And it's so heartwarming and beautiful. That's what I'm into. But I think it made me feel that my book is more heartwarming than I realized when the pandemic came around too. So there was something about that. I was so anxious when this book came out. Like I just thought I was going to make a big fool of myself. And what the heck was I doing? And people would laugh. I mean, this is the story in my head. And then I'm having this interview with you and it's like blowing my mind.
I laughed, but I laughed at the funny parts. And I also bawled. I bawled several times. It wasn't just at the end. It was like during as well. And like for me, the relationship with Edie was just so heartwarming and so powerful. Yeah. I just
so happy. It's like, ooh. If I can impress a poet, my goodness, I don't know what to do with this now. I'm my head is so big now. I'm just so conceited now.
Well, maybe that's where we should end so that we can deflate you a little bit.
Yeah, my husband said he can't cope with this. He can't cope with it with me. And there's awards next week too. The Atlantic Book Awards are next week, and the book's been nominated for like two of them. It blows my mind. I'm already, suffering with the big head syndrome.
Well, I mean, deservedly. It's an absolutely fantastic book. And thank you so much for writing it. And thank you so much for talking to me today.
My pleasure. And, I can't tell you what it means to me that this book has spoken to you in this way. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.